Chapter 14. That son of a bitch sure has a lot of guts to come here to preach, the bishop said, jamming his hands deep into his pockets of his best winter coat. That son of a bitch was Christian Adolph Brewer, newest High Councilman in Bear Lake Stake, making his first official visit to the Snowville ward. Fred Calvert, the bishop's first counselor, said, "That damned hypocrite will probably talk on the word of wisdom or juvenile delinquency. Well, he's had lots of experience with both," Bishop Jackson added. "It'll be mightily hard for me to pay much attention to him tonight. I well remember in the 20s when he got all his money bootlegging." The two men opened the big wooden door to the Snowville ward meeting house and went to light the fires to warm the building for sacrament meeting, less than 2 hours away. Although it was 1946 and the 1920s were in the past, many in Snowville still remembered. In 1933, the 18th Amendment had been repealed under the guiding hand of newly elected President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and then C.A. Brewer was out of a job. Latter-day Saints forgot or never knew that the prophet Joseph Smith always opposed the concept of prohibition. His explanation was very simple. You can't legislate people into heaven. Republicans Herbert J. Grant, E. Nephi Benson, and C.A. Brewer were furious when Prohibition came to an end, but for different reasons. The repeal put an end to the $15,000 a year business for Brewer. The others were angry because it was no longer unlawful, but only immoral to sell, buy, or consume liquor. Even with his income cut off, C.A. was still sitting pretty. In the past 12 years, he had accumulated more than $150,000 in illegal profits, all of it in spite of the Depression. Fitz Brewer, C.A.'s father, had come from Germany in the 1880s. He had always made his own beer and liquor for family use, as had other European families for generations, and young Adolph Brewer learned the art of brewing for himself. Adolph Brewer got into the bootlegging business by accident with an enactment of the 18th Amendment. The supply of liquor, but not the demand for it, was shut off. In 1920, he owned a blacksmith shop and was in debt. He had the equipment to make the brew inherited from his father, and soon found out that men were willing to pay a premium price for a drink. He started out making whiskey with his brother-in-law, Joe Herzog, but before long found out that the real money was in selling it. Eventually, he turned over the production end to Joe and others and concentrated on selling. The biggest year he had was 1928. That year, Joe Herzog, Roy Schaefer, and Delbert Goff made the bootleg in 3 different stills, located in Snowville, Bloomington, and Garden City. Brewer also bought liquor wholesale in Kemmer, the bootlegging capital of Western America. The large inventory was sold in Bear Lake County, Garden City, and Randolph, Utah, and in Evanston and Cokeville, Wyoming in 1928. Adolph Brewer put $20,000 in the bank, drawing 5% interest. In clandestine nature of acquiring and consuming liquor appealed more to younger men than did the taste. Whiskey on the breath of a young man at a Saturday night dance was the most important thing next to a ticket. While the girls made the expected token protest when asked to dance by one of the drinkers, it was obvious that the boys who smelled of whiskey did most of the dancing. Because of their tender age, the deacons, 12, 14 years old, couldn't buy booze, even from a bootlegger. Most of them didn't have the money anyway, but like their older brothers, they desired the smell of liquor. A youth of 14 obtained the status of a man among the teenage girls as soon as he could acquire the smell of whiskey and quit school. Draining the dregs of the discarded flask was only for young boys who wanted to taste booze for the first time. Stealing liquor added to the excitement of tampering with the stuff. While the older boys were dancing, the deacons came to the church house on the dance nights, but usually hung out around the perimeter of the dance floor, stealing whiskey, forwarding intoxication, punching each other on the arm, and starting fights. The dancing men were the ones who brought the whiskey. Although law enforcement officers winked at prohibition, some of the glamour of acquiring whiskey was lost unless the liquor was hidden. During the winter, pint flasks of booze were hidden in sleighs or under the blankets of horses. The deacons knew all the hiding places and searched all the sleighs thoroughly. For most of them, one small taste was enough. After 3 or 4 of the boys had taken a swallow each, they replaced the contents of the flask by urinating into it. The urination was not so much to try to conceal the theft as to show contempt for the big boys who could acquire the stuff in a semi-legal manner. The owners of the bottles, who came out of every third dance for a swig of liquor, seldom detected the presence of a chaser. The stuff was so bad to begin with that the contribution of the deacons often improved the taste. If a boy was caught stealing whiskey, not much could be done except to kick him in the rear and cuff him around the ears a few times. After all, he couldn't be prosecuted for stealing illegal liquor. Being caught and bragging to his friends was almost as much fun as smelling the booze. Experience taught the brethren that the safest place to hide a whiskey flask was behind the pulpit in the church house. So Christian Adolph Brewer became a bootleg czar of Bear Lake and waxed rich. "Goddamn Roosevelt, that Democrat son of a bitch," Brewer had said 100 times in 1933, and the repeal of the 18th Amendment made permanent Republicans of the whole Brewer clan. In 1933, Adolph Brewer was unemployed, but he had $150,000 in the bank, drawing $6,000 in interest every year. He didn't have the stomach to go back to the blacksmith shop and had acquired a lust for money. 15 years earlier, he had borrowed money at 10% interest, but now he had money to lend. Adolph was a natural banker. He had a head for figures and computed his earned interest every night. By 1936, he had most of his money on interest to individuals and was making $12,000 to $15,000 a year. It was only about half of his income in bootleg days, but he was making good money and could increase his capital and income each year. To his dying day, Brewer would lust after money, but it was no longer a problem to acquire. In 1937, the one thing he didn't have, respectability. In the heyday of Prohibition, he had done almost everything to make money. He had taken the last dime of many a father for a flask of booze. He had rolled men who became drunk before they got off his premises. He had even acquired an interest in whorehouses in Kemmer and Evanston as profitable outlets for his whiskey. He had traded many pint flasks for saddles, rifles, and livestock. Women had cursed him for contributing to the downfall of their husbands and sons, and ward bishops had denounced him from the pulpit. However, the Mormon Church admired money and didn't worry too much about where it came from. When Adolph Brewer paid $1,500 in tithing in 1938, he was well on the road to rehabilitation in the eyes of the church. By the fall of 1939, the name Adolf Hitler was a hiss and a byword in the United States. For business reasons, Christian Adolph Brewer legally changed his name to C.A. Brewer. Bishop Jackson compared with a great deal of interest the lives of C.A. and his cousin Otto Brewer. Otto served a mission at the age of 20, was second counselor in the Bloomington Ward Bishopric from age 23 to 34, and as Bishop of Bloomington Ward from age 34 to 53. During his service, he gave more than 3/4 of his time to the church. President Benson called on him to serve as chairman in the Bishop's Council and chairman of the Genealogy Committee in addition to his many ward duties. Each year, Bishop Brewer's farm grew more neglected, and his debt increased. In the last year as bishop, he sold the farm for $500 more than the mortgage and went to work as a janitor for $100 a month in Paris. In his 19 years as bishop, he had neglected his health and home life, except for one important aspect, the regular impregnation of his wife. When he was released as bishop, he was broken in health, was $5,000 in debt, and had no assets except his clothing and a 7-year-old automobile. Bishop Brewer's 8 children were undernourished, they had bad teeth, and none of them could afford more than 2 years of high school. Bishop Brewer could never pay any of the $5,000 he owed, and was viewed as a deadbeat by the business community. After a long illness, he resumed his job as janitor at the Paris Ward Church and the Paris Bank. His children left home and went to work by the time each was 16 years of age. Members of the Bear Lake Stake soon forgot the 33 years of continuous service he had given to the church. They forgot that he had neglected education, employment, health, and family for the church. In later years, when he couldn't work anymore, he lived off church and county welfare and was generally regarded as a bum. In 1939, C.A. Brewer was appointed finance chairman of the Paris First Ward Building Committee. In 1941, the prospect of a war was viewed by C.A. Brewer with mixed emotions. A man with money could always increase his fortune in wartime, but C.A. was worried about his son, Gerald. Gerald was his only son, aged 26, married a year, but with no children. In the event of a war, C.A. was afraid Gerald would be drafted. Gerald had been sent for his education to Brigham Young University and then to Harvard Business College, and C.A. had bought him an insurance agency in Salt Lake City. Gerald was making $10,000 a year in insurance and had a bright future. Gerald hadn't been directly affected by the bootleg money, and C.A. enjoyed a reflection of respectability through him. All of it would be lost if Gerald went to war and was killed or wounded. At best, he would have to spend 3 or 4 years at low wages. C.A. carefully weighed the alternatives. He could send Gerald on a mission, as many fathers were doing. However, a mission would only last 2 years and the war would last longer, perhaps 4 years. Also, the loss in family income from the $1,000 a year required to keep a missionary would be too much for thrifty brother Brewer to swallow. He remembered that in World War I, farmers were exempt from military duty and had made a lot of money. In May 1941, C.A. paid $20,000 for a dairy farm, and turned over the management to Gerald. The younger Brewer was reclassified in the draft as a farmer, and he spent 4 years, 3 months, and 13 days as a dairy farmer. On September 3, 1945, the day after signing for the peace treaty in Tokyo Bay, Gerald left the farm with his wife and baby daughter. The haying and harvesting were left uncompleted. C.A. put a man on the farm to finish the work, then sold the property and livestock for $50,000. The business had made good money during the war, and he had more than doubled his investment. Less than a dozen people in Salt Lake City knew that Gerald had sat out the war on a milk stool. 5,000 people in Bear Lake Valley knew it, but they didn't buy their insurance in Salt Lake City anyway. So it was in May 1945 that Brother C.A. Brewer was ordained a high priest, and for a few months later was made a member of the Bear Lake State High Council. He was now worth $500,000 and had paid a lot of tithing in the past 12 years. He had a lifetime record of observing the word of wisdom, even during bootleg days. He had never had a drop of the rot gut. He had observed all the outward trappings and formalities of religion. It's a hell of a lot easier to repent on $500,000 than it is if you're out at the elbows, the bishop said thoughtfully as he adjusted the damper on the stovepipe to a horizontal position.